Today we'll be taking a look at the biggest flamethrowers that the Sisters of Battle Codex has to offer, with a look at the Immolator tank. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Over the last few weeks we've been looking at the units from the Sisters of Battle Codex one by one, taking a look at their datasheets and seeing how we can make them function efficiently on the tabletop. Today we've reached the Immolator tank in its lovely new incarnation with a stained glass window that protects the gunner and enormous flamethrowers to either side of it. In this video we'll take a look over its datasheet, any obvious rules, combos, synergies and tactics that we can see, and how I would put them to use on the table. In the background, Immolators are a variant of the standard Rhino chassis, with the main gun being operated by a Dominion sister who has undergone additional vehicle training. The stained glass is reinforced, so hopefully it's not going to shatter quite as easily on the first impact, which would have made me quite nervous about sitting behind it in the first place, and it's used in a similar fashion to the Space Marine Razorbacks, sacrificing some of its transport capacity for increased battlefield firepower. Immolators are often assigned to specialist formations, such as Dominions, Celestians or Retributors, adding its firepower to theirs to give the best chance of their specific mission at succeeding. It can swap out its mighty Immolator Flamers for twin multi-melters for an armoured punch, or some heavy bolters for a longer ranged onslaught. So let's see how this tank can function on the field of battle. So the Immolator is of course a dedicated transport slot for Codex Adepta Sororitas, and in its cheapest incarnation armed with twin heavy bolters it'll cost you 97 points. It can upgrade them to an Emulation Flamer for an additional 13 points, making the tank 110 points, or twin multi-melters for an 120 point Immolator. In addition to these main weapons, it's also armed with a hull heavy bolter, which is factored into the above points cost. The Immolator has an entirely normal Rhino chassis profile, movement 12, toughness 7, 10 wounds, and a 3-up save, and it has a ballistic skill of 3+. We all know what twin heavy bolters and twin multi-melters do, but what about that Immolation Flamer? The Immolation Flamer is essentially a twin heavy flamer profile that has a 12-inch range. So it's 12-inch range, assault 2d6, strength 5, AP -1, damage 1. And like all flamer type weapons, it automatically hits its target. Aside from the main weapons, it can also take a hunter-killer missile, which isn't the worst expenditure in the world if you're expecting the tank to be sat still, but if you're thinking about moving it around then it's probably not the best idea, seeing as it'll only be hitting on force, so it might be a bit more of a waste of points. It's not a terrible option though, just because the sisters don't have all that many long-ranged anti-tank shots, and having anything extra can really help. In terms of the different weapons, I think all of them can have their role. If it has heavy bolters, it'll certainly synergize with its whole-mounted weapon well, so you'll be blazing away with 9 heavy bolter shots at the enemy per turn. It's not exactly the most overwhelming firepower in the world. The main advantage of this one is that it's just a cheap transport, that you don't have to worry too much about getting the main value out of its other weapons. I really like the Emulation Flamer. I think it's far better than standard flamer weapons. That 12-inch range means that you can't charge it unless you're within range of it, so it should usually be getting overwatch against you, and on average you will be getting 7 hits automatically on the opponent. Not too shabby at all for driving back the foe. The multi-melters are pretty expensive, but in the twin multi-melter version it's a little bit less so than some of the other options, so it's not the worst anti-tank fire in the world, but having to move and shoot most likely to get them in range means that you'll only be hitting on force, which isn't exactly ideal. They do turn an otherwise fairly unthreatening transport unit into a fairly reasonable anti-tank critter though, so I think that they can have their role. I do think that all of the different variants are reasonably viable. The heavy bolters are essentially if you want a little bit of anti-infantry firepower on a Rhino chassis, the flamers for some slightly more efficient but closer ranged firepower, and the multi-melters to turn it into more of an anti-tank platform. It has the usual Sisters of Battle special rules, including Acts of Faith, Sacred Rites, which might be useful for the one that gives you extra AP on wound rolls of 6, that could be particularly nice for the heavy bolter or flamer variants, and Shield of Faith, which will give you a 6+ invul save, so help against the very highest AP weapons that are out there. As always, they have smoke launchers as well, so if you're caught short without being able to shoot a target, you may as well activate them. In terms of its transport capacity, it can transport any 6 Adeptus Ministorum infantry, unless they have jump packs, so typical transport options could be things like Repentia, Dominions, Battle Conclave units, Retributors, or Celestians. We'll talk a little bit more about transport options in a second, but first let's have a look at the different orders and how they can affect the Immolator tank. In terms of orders, firstly all the ones including our Martyred Lady that make better use of miracle dice are a bit more handy with the multi-melters, as they're big high value shots that having an automatic hit or an automatic damage of 6 could be incredibly handy for. Having an automatic 6 shots as well out of the Immolation Flamer could also be great, so it's another potential target for using Miracle Dice. Valorous Heart are a very good option for vehicles. That 6+ Feel No Pain type save and ignoring AP-1 combine to really make tanks a lot more durable, and is possibly one of the best choices for an Immolator. Ebon Chalice have the option of maximising Flamer shots for a 2 command point stratagem. It's not necessarily the most efficient ever damage output in terms of command points for extra wounds on the target, but having an auto 12-shot Immolation Flamer at the exact right moment in the battle could really put the hurt on a valuable enemy infantry unit. Ardent Shroud are an interesting choice for a mobile Immolator, particularly as they can advance and shoot their ranged weapons as if they haven't advanced. This is really good for getting things like multi-melters or those Immolation Flamers in range. They essentially get an extra d6 movement and still be able to shoot, and extra mobility is always nice. Finally, Sacred Rose has a slightly better overwatch, which might be better with the multi-melters, and also having extra Miracle Dice is also quite good for multi-melters as well. Overall though, it is probably Valorous Heart that I think is the most solid all-round buff. Just getting some extra wounds on the tanks as well as that extra durability against AP-1 weapons like autocannons is quite a handy little combo. In terms of character support, as always things like the Canoness or Untitled Chapter might be able to add some reroll damage output to the Immolator tanks, and a Magifier is useful for ignoring an AP-1 and is doubly good in Valorous Heart where you'll be ignoring AP-2 as well. And the Immolator can be a reasonable place for characters to hide out of line of sight turn 1 on if you're worried about snipers and things. In missions where you have alternating drops as well, this can keep your drop count down if you put a few characters in transport vehicles turn 1, maybe giving you a bit more chance of getting first turn. In terms of stratagems, the Immolator has a particularly potent one, and this is Martyr's Immolation. Now if you watch many of the other videos in this channel, then you'll be aware of just how much I love stratagems that make things blow up automatically. This is exactly that, and for 1 command point when your Immolator dies, you can auto-explode the thing, showering everything around you with D3 mortal wounds. This really does reward the strategy of throwing a few Flamer Immolators into the jaws of the enemy. You'll give the enemy a durable threat that they need to deal with unless they want a lot of their infantry cooked, and when they do deal with them, if they happen to be in the middle of the enemy army, then they might do more damage in death than they ever did in life. I would honestly go as far to say that this could be used if you have an Immolator on its last legs. You could charge it into an enemy fighty character, making sure that you're in the midst of a whole ton of units, then automatically blowing it up when the character kills it. If you could position it so there's a lot of enemy units in the blast radius, you could be handing out 5 or 6 auto smites in one go. Genuinely, for me, this is one of the biggest draws to the Immolator, and the Sisters of Battle must enjoy it too, as it combines both martyrdom and burning heretics, 2 of their favourite things. Another really handy stratagem for the Immolator is Judgment of the Faithful. This is a 2 command point stratagem that allows the Immolator to fall back and still shoot, and then even charge if it wants to tie something else up. This could well be immensely disruptive if the opponent thinks they've dealt with the threat. By locking it up in close combat, then it falls back and flames you anyway. Those are by far my favourite too. Also things like Moment of Grace are also potentially useful, as they are with any Sisters of Battle unit. So in game we've got a few different options for use for the Immolator. Firstly, we could just use it as a bit of a cheap gun tank to put a little bit of extra hurt on the enemy and potentially cause some disruption in their ranks, charging forward with those flamers and potentially auto-exploding. They aren't necessarily the scariest thing in the entire Sisters army, and they're at least fairly durable point for point, so there's a good chance they might be a bit ignored in favour of some of the other units and actually get to put their heavy weapons to work for a few turns before they draw the ire of the enemy too much. Alternatively, we can think about transporting things in them. If we are just throwing them forwards as a threat for the enemy to deal with, something like a cheap squad of Battle Sisters might be a good idea, just to have some OBSEC units in the midfield to score some objectives and make them very annoying to remove from the board. If we're actually looking at threatening the enemy, then things like Dominions with Melters or Flamers, or Retributors with virtually any loadout, particularly multi-melters, could be pretty good to be shielded in an Immolator for a turn, as it'll keep them safe and they don't suffer any penalty from moving and shooting out of a transport. Repentia are certainly another solid option to use in an Immolator. They're incredibly destructive once they reach the enemy, as well as being quite fragile, so they really do need a shield between them and the enemy's guns if they want to make it there in one piece. You might be better off with a Rhino or Repressor or something though, because you might want a bigger squad of them on the board, and perhaps even some character support. In game you really need to think about what their role is and how they're going to contribute to the battle. If you're just using some Flamer ones, then starting them towards the front of your deployment zone is a good idea to try and get those Flamers to use as early as possible in the game. and they're at least somewhat of a pain to charge because of all of that nasty overwatch. If you're giving them multi-melter turrets, then it's probably better to at least try and screen them a bit so the enemy can't tag them in close combat, as multi-melters are expensive and you kind of want them to be firing for the entire game long to try and get as much value out of them as possible, so you don't want them locked up. If you're putting a bunch of sisters with melters or flamers in them though, the main thing you need to think about is when you're planning to get them out. Particularly for things like retributors, it might be easiest just to plan to get them out at the start of your first turn. If they get out in front of the Immolator, then they can gain a few inches towards the enemy straight away. Otherwise, I'd think about positioning the Immolator for an optimal drop turn 2. Hope that the Immolator survives, and then get them out and fry the enemy starting from your second turn. After they've delivered their payload, the Immolator's job is largely done, so I'd be thinking about using them as disruption and distraction units. Throw them forwards towards the enemy lines, barbecue some troops, potentially think about even charging some gunline elements to lock them up and make them have to drop back, and absolutely remember to auto-detonate them if and when they go down, if you're going to shower a lot of enemy units with a lot of mortal wounds. Overall, I think that the Immolator's main competition is the Sororitas Rhino, which is significantly cheaper but doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of heavy firepower. Basically the trade-off is whether or not the lost transport capacity and the extra points spent on heavy weapons are really worth it for the damage output that you're getting out of them, compared with just having a very cheap tank that can put a durable layer between the enemy and your fragile battle sisters inside, who want to be delivered to the enemy front lines intact if possible. In general, I think that both are fairly viable, but it will change a bit about how the unit is used. With Rhinos, you really can afford to just use them as complete screening and blocking units once their job is done. With Immolators, you might want to preserve them a little bit more to try and retain that firepower. The Repressor is also a solid contender for Adepta Sororitas transport vehicles. It's one of the Forge World choices, and it allows you to fire guns even while models are still inside the vehicle, and it can still mount 2 heavy flamers, so it can still pack a bit of a punch itself. This might be a go-to option for things like Retributors or Dominions or things, where they can still shoot without even getting out of the tank. So overall, the Immolator is a solid unit, but does face some stiff competition from the Rhino and the Repressor, and indeed the other units from the Sister Battle Codex. I'd say it's best used to be transporting some Retributors in to keep them safe for a turn, and then add its firepower and durability to the rest of the army. I'll be honest, the game isn't the kindest to transport vehicles at the moment. They do sometimes struggle to fulfill their own niche, just because of when the infantry tend to get out of the transport vehicles. I'd say it's a moderately competitive unit in the Sister Battle Codex. I'd be interested to see if they do wind up making it into any top tier army lists going forward. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you'd like to see more Warhammer 40k content like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you've been enjoying the content, feel free to support me on Patreon as well, as it's what allows me to keep on going making these videos every day, as they do take quite a while to make. The link's down in the description if you're interested, and a big thank you to all of you who are currently supporting the channel. Thanks very much for listening, I'll hope to see you guys next time.